Hey everybody, David Brewster here with a new series. This is Scales and Tales, and I am going to start kind of branching out late night lessons to include scales. I also have an idea of kind of moving into like melodic arpeggios and kind of reveal some really cool things you can do with some of the chords we've looked at, but then turning those chords into useful and melodic arpeggios, string skipping and sweeping and all that stuff. But Scales and Tales is mainly going to stick with scales, modes, kind of helping you understand, some of these things that you hear guitarists do that is scale based. So really, in music theory and in terminology and the way all of this is kind of grouped together, chords come from scales. And then of course arpeggios are the notes of chords, played separately. So it's all interlinked and related. It's very closely tied together. Um, like the chords that you hear in a song come from a scale. The melodies and guitar solos and licks that you hear in those songs come from the scale. So it's all interlinked and related. But it is useful to kind of separate these worlds. Think of chords and arpeggios and kind of relate them together. And then you have single note things, riffs, solos, and licks, and things like that. So even though they're related and they complement and kind of branch out from each other, it is kind of good to kind of keep them separated, at least a little bit, just so you can kind of approach and work on, uncovering some of this, some of the mystery, behind this stuff. So I do have some ideas as far as, approaching scales and, different views and ways of learning scales. And of course, we're going to talk about modes and exotic scales and all sorts of stuff. But I thought a good way to kind of kick this series off is to reveal something that I've worked on with a lot of students over the years, especially, the students that were interested in tapping into themselves, creating their own sounds and songs and licks and solos, and it is really exciting and eye-opening, to work on somebody else's music and to copy it, verbatim or try to learn it note for note. But I think it's, over the years, it's become more interesting for me to tap into myself than it is to just, kind of copy somebody else. And, my own music and lessons and a lot of the material that I've put together in my career um, has been me just kind of feeding or pleasing, myself as a musician. Like, hey, that's cute, that's interesting, or I'm curious what that is. And then I'll kind of move toward it and work on it. And so the theme behind this, first lesson or first installment for Scales and Tales is related to a song from the band Tesla, back from the 80s. And the song Modern Day Cowboy. I remember when I first heard that song, I think actually my sister had a recording, of Mechanical Resonance, and I heard it. And right off the bat, this song grabbed my attention. Coming at You Live grabbed my attention because it has that crazy, like end of the world, dual guitar solo in the beginning. When I heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, I love this band. There's so much guitar. But I was a kid. That's where my ears were. I was in rock and roll land. Eddie Van Halen high school is where I was when I was a teenager. I distinctly remember I borrowed my sister's, copy of her album, and I went in my room and I played the intro of the song over and over. I heard the guitar solo and stuff, and I had no idea how to play any of that at that time. Um, but I just focused on the intro. I was trying to understand because I just heard, that opening run, and to my ears, at 14 or 15 or however old I was, when I heard that opening run, I just heard this flurry of notes. It just sounded so fast, and everything was kind of hitting, in that intro, and it blew me away. I thought, oh my gosh, I want to try to figure out how to play that. So I remember I sat in my room, I looped that opening intro, I don't know how many times, and I just kind of clued in, just by listening to it by ear. And that's kind of what I came up with. And, I didn't realize that they were just kind of hitting, the first note, and then they sped through that run. So my 14, 15-year-old ears heard this. And that's what I thought they were playing, two groups of 6 notes. But, come to find out later when I saw a transcription, then I realized they're just hitting F and then like a 9-note run, like that. So that's the correct way to play it. But what we're gonna do here, we're gonna work on my mistake, or we're gonna find some really cool things you can do with the way that I learned it incorrectly. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, why do I want to learn this song wrong? I'm not really wanting to show you how to play Modern Day Cowboy. I'm just using that as an example and just kind of bouncing off that song like a trampoline. So I'm borrowing something I learned from the song and then turning that into something original or creative or new. So here, we're basically playing, like a little F major run. And that's a great, kind of stretchy workout. If you're not used to using your pinky and you're not used to that whole step fingering, that's a great pattern just to play, just those, 12 notes. You can reverse it, go down. That's the first thing you should do when you make a variation of something you learned, a lick or a phrase or a fragment of an idea. Play it, say if it's ascending, play it ascending, and then flip it around the other way and see what it sounds like when you descend. So the same lick, you can kind of approach that 2 different ways. Now, if you go a little deeper in the song, you can hear there's kind of an extended version of that. And of course, my 14, 15-year-old ears played it the wrong way. I was learning it by ear, and I thought they were doing this. And that's just 2 groups of the same thing. And then the same thing, a whole step higher. And they're really just kind of racing up to target that A note, because the song itself's very prominently in A, it's revolving around, these kind of sinister and, gothic sounding chords. So it's very A throughout the song. But this run that I uncovered, even though it's not technically the way they played it, they just played, that first note and then the run. So just to be thorough here, technically what's happening when you do this extended run, we're basically flirting with 2 modes. The first part, if we relate that back to A or A minor, which the song is predominantly in the key of A, leaning more toward an A minor, because you have all these, dreary chords. So really, that first run is technically A Phrygian, is what that would be. If we played this, if you played F major over A minor, it's going to sound like A Phrygian. And then the second run technically is hinting at A Dorian. So you can kind of think of this, 2-part run as a modal interchange in a way. Now the guitar solo in the song isn't in Phrygian, isn't in Dorian. It's basically, pentatonic and natural minor. But that run itself is kind of blurring between Phrygian and Dorian related to A, which is interesting. So once again, my mistake is kind of your benefit. Or you're going to benefit from my mistake, that is. So now we have this longer, bigger phrase, and we're kind of using a little bit more of the fretboard too, which is good. So you might be thinking, well, now what are we going to do with this? So we can, take the first phrase, ascend, descend, take the second longer phrase, ascend and descend. And then the next thing I would recommend is just move it around in octaves. So literally anywhere on the neck where you have that starting note F, as long as you have enough room, fret-wise, and if you have enough strings, you can't put it like way up high where you're on, like say maybe the high E string or something. You got to have some room to kind of move through that phrase. But, we can move it out of open position, and we'll just take that initial run let's just start right there on F and then run that up on the D, G, and the B string. And you can see there we're going to have to modify the shape to kind of fit in the key that we're in. So when we get to the B string, you're going to have to go up an extra fret. And play that ascending and descending. And then you can also extend it to the larger, the larger phrase. And just end on that A note right there, on the 10th fret on the B. Something like that. Now, like I said, anywhere you have that F, you can start that phrase. So we're going to keep it in the same octave, but we're going to change positions now. So now we're going to start on this F instead of this F. Same note, just a different position. So now we're going to do that same thing, but we're going to start right here. And of course, the original phrase, the shorter version, is right there. And then the full, complete version. Once you've kind of investigated that higher position, of course, you could mimic, the same thing that we did an octave higher. On the same strings, just literally an octave higher, on the low E, A, and D. Or we could, continue moving higher and go, even further into, higher positions and include other strings. So now instead of this, let's put it right there and just start on F here on the 10th fret on the G. Right? And then we can do the full, kind of extended version. And you can grab that A right there. Of course, you can descend that pattern, of course. And you could make some other variations to the phrase. But we're just kind of locking in to my misheard version of that original riff that came from, Modern Day Cowboy. But then we've made all these different variations and wandered around the fretboard with that phrase. So really what I'm sharing here isn't Modern Day Cowboy. More or less, I'm sharing a concept with you. So, if you learn something, say you learn something by ear, maybe it's not quite right, or you hear something in your head and you're trying to figure out, this song or melody or something that's in your head, I think that's really, really, really beneficial to do. Like, don't be afraid to try that, play and experiment, and create different sounds and ideas and use your imagination, and get lost in a chord or a scale or arpeggio or a lick or a phrase and just see what happens. Don't be afraid to kind of play around. All right, well, that's going to wrap up the first installment here of Scales and Tales. And like I said, I'd like to explore, scales and modes, and, we can talk about all sorts of things with this series. So leave some comments and feedback and let me know what you think about Scales and Tales and the Modern Day Cowboy kind of variations here. And, practice this. You can change tonalities. You could change it to a different fingering or shape. All right, well, leave some feedback and some comments, and please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back with some more lessons in 3 for All and chord play and scales and tales before you know it. Thank you.